One of the most prominent and pernicious claims that theists, and indeed some atheists, are currently making is that Western civilization is based on Judeo-Christian values.
The values that resonate most with human beings are eternal, not changeable, and not relativistic. They are universal, they are not group-specific. And most of all, they apply to individual human beings, not group labels. And those values were first embedded clearly and concisely in the Ten Commandments.
Our foundational principles, certainly in Western culture, come from Christianity.
Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding.
To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality.
European and American culture, which is based on Judeo-Christian values, is better than other cultures. I think it's uncontroversial to say so.
That was the basic foundation of America. It was a Judeo-Christian ethic. It was a Judeo-Christian reasoning.
The Catholic Church built Western civilization.
Western civilization at large was built upon Christianity. That's a fact.
And yet, this claim is absolute nonsense. And what's worse, it's often not even an argument. It's just an assertion, a statement that straight out ignores history and science. This is Western civilization is based on Judeo-Christian values, debunked. Now, it tends to be quite easy to take on this claim, because, as just said, that's often all it is, a claim, and so refuting it tends to merely require a swift motion from Hitchens' razor. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. But in the few cases in which an argument is actually given, it tends to be in reference to morality, which in effect is the assertion that Western morality is based on the assumption that the Abrahamic God exists.
Most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic.
Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding.
Our foundational principles, certainly in Western culture, come from Christianity.
I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God.
Now, the first thing to be said about most of those who make this assertion is that they are utterly ignoring history before Judaism, and in doing so, they're just expecting us to assume that before its inception, people somehow didn't know that it's wrong to kill, exploit, and steal. That before the Ten Commandments, life was nasty, brutish, and short. But this simply isn't true. Evidence shows that official laws against murder and theft date back at least 4,400 years to Lagash, Mesopotamia, which of course is 600 years before the birth of Judaism, and that official laws abolishing slavery only date back 200 years, which of course is 3,600 years after Judaism. But since these facts don't fit the Judeo-Christian narrative, let's just ignore them, right? I mean, it's not like Abrahamic religion hasn't ignored and still ignores facts that contradict it, is it?
Those values were first embedded clearly and concisely in the Ten Commandments.
Or to put this all another way, most of those who make this assertion just expect us to believe that an evolved social species somehow didn't evolve social norms, that despite all of the evidence telling us otherwise, such as the fact that wolves, elephants, chimpanzees, rats, bats and whales have all been proven to exhibit moral behaviour, humans for some reason require divine intervention. You know, I think it's worth me doubling down here, because for whatever reason many seem to have a hard time understanding how human morality could have emerged naturally, when it's really quite simple. We are sentient beings that have evolved the capacity to feel pain and the desire to avoid it, and our recognition that the best way to achieve this is by cooperating and establishing rules is morality. It's that simple. Morality isn't this mysterious, unfathomable thing. The religious just need it to be. Because, to paraphrase the founding father and second US President John Adams, mystery is a convenient excuse for absurdity. Anyhow, with the question of where do moral values come from answered, I'm convinced that the best way to succinctly address the primary assertion is to first identify Western values, and to then trace back when, where, and why they emerged. And so, let's start with freedom of speech, the very bedrock of a free society, and the right that allows us to enact and defend all other rights. Is this Western value of Judeo-Christian origin? No. Both the Old and New Testament proclaim strict limitations on free speech, through primarily blasphemy laws, and until very recently Jewish and Christian governments declared exactly the same. Hell, the Inquisition is the antithesis of free speech, as they literally incinerated anyone who didn't share their barbaric, unenlightened beliefs. So far as evidence indicates, the principle of free speech and expression dates back 2,500 years to ancient Athens and the Roman Republic. But true freedom of speech didn't emerge until the early Enlightenment, 1689, with first the British Bill of Rights and shortly after the French Revolution, 3,500 years after Judaism and 1,700 years after Christianity. Moving on, what about liberty? You know, the abolition of slavery, and with it the pursuit of happiness. Did this value that so characterizes the West come from Judaism or Christianity? Again, no. The Old and New Testament both explicitly endorse slavery, and in fact provide rules and regulations for several categories of slaves, regulations that both Jews and Christians enacted and upheld during the vast majority of their time in power. The truth of the matter is that the principle of liberty dates back, again, 2,500 years to Athens, when the lawgiver Solon abolished debt slavery and freed all Athenian citizens who had formerly been enslaved. But true abolition of slavery didn't occur until the 19th century, 3,600 years after Judaism and 1,800 years after Christianity. Now some, such as Theo Hobson, would argue that since Christianity dominated the West during this time, the abolition of slavery was, and still is, rooted in Judeo-Christian values. But this is as fallacious as asserting that since animal rights first emerged in Hindu culture, therefore animal rights was, and still is, rooted in Hindu values. It's a type of false cause fallacy. Okay, well, what about democracy? The ability to elect, and more importantly remove, our leaders. Surely, the West inherited this moral from Judeo-Christian values, right? Again, no. Absolutely not. Both the Old and New Testament explicitly endorse theocracy, which is a system of government in which one or more people rule in the name of a god or gods. And, surprise surprise, throughout history, Judaism and Christianity have enforced such a government. For example, in medieval Europe, in which Judeo-Christian values absolutely dominated, the monarch could do whatever they wanted to whoever they wanted without justification, because he had the divine right of kings. The principle of democracy can be traced back, again, 2,500 years to Athens, when Cleisthenes reformed their constitution so that randomly selected citizens could assume administrative and judicial offices. However, it wasn't perfect, as citizenship excluded women, slaves, foreigners, non-landowners, and men under the age of 20. Unfortunately, as just mentioned, the principle was buried during medieval Europe, but it saw a significant resurgence in the 18th century due to Enlightenment values, and true democracy, as in all citizens who are mentally capable above the age of 18 being able to vote, was finally established in the 20th century, 3,700 years after Judaism, and 1,900 years after Christianity. And while we're on the topic of suffrage, what about equality in general? You know, equal opportunity for all ethnicities, all sexes, all classes, all ages, and all sexual preferences. Was this beacon of freedom and equality a gift from Judaism or Christianity? Again, no. Judeo-Christian edicts fervently oppose such equality, demanding the subordination of women, the execution of homosexuals, and, as already mentioned, the endorsement of slavery and the execution of blasphemers. And so, again, it's no surprise that medieval Europe embodied precisely just that. Now, I could go on by tracing back the foundation of all Western values and practices, such as Easter and Christmas, which are both pagan festivals that have been appropriated by Christianity, but I think I've more than made my point. Western civilization did not emerge from Judeo-Christian values, it emerged despite them. Western civilization was conceived in ancient Athens, and it most flourished during the Age of Enlightenment in direct opposition to Judeo-Christian values. Now, don't get me wrong, I appreciate and acknowledge that many Jews and Christians played a significant role in shaping Western morality, but they didn't do so because of Judeo-Christian values. They did so because of their own evolved moral conscience, which they then projected onto their religion. And that's why, not surprisingly, absolute divine laws are forever changing. Now, just before I wrap up, and on a completely different note, I've got a question for you all. Would you possibly be interested in a card game in which the purpose is to debunk theistic arguments by playing the right fallacies, all while preventing your opponent from doing the same by playing cards such as "That's just a theory"? If so, please let me know, because I have a great game mechanic in mind, an awesome art direction, and I'd simply love to kickstart the project. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have donated via PayPal. Your support is what allows me to adequately address claims such as this one, and so you have my sincere gratitude. Until next time, my fellow weeps, until next time.